Hi everyone, my name is Cyril Filias and I'm the lead program learning and development at CEREC. And on behalf of the entire team, welcome to today's webinar. Today, we are excited to launch a two-part webinar series delivered for the very first time ever on a semi-live format and presented by Trevor Lehman and Brian Mallett, called Decent Work on a Changing Planet, Practical Strategy for Developing a More Equitable World for Our Clients. We are thrilled that you decide to join us today, and I want to take a moment to share my gratitude and invite you to reflect on the lens on which you are located right now and on your relationship with this lens. Today, on the day of the recording of this video, I'm coming to you from my home in a city we now call Toronto, which has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Petun, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississauga Anishinaabe of New Credit. I recognize that the Indigenous people are the original stewards and caretaker of these lands and of these waters. And CEREC is committed to engaging Canada career development community in this journey of reconciliation through our education and research work and collaborations. We would like to take the land acknowledgements as opportunities to share resources that you might find interesting to explore. Today, we'll be sharing in the chat the recording of our recent webinar series on Indigenous knowledge and worldview of career development, where career practitioners from Canada and New Zealand met, discussed, and shared very interesting perspective on cultural approaches to Indigenous career development. I will also like to invite anyone who find a good resources or resources that they would like to share with their colleague to do so in the chat as well. I will now take a few moments to introduce you to CEREC and share some housekeeping note with you. So for those of you who don't know us yet, CEREC is a charitable organization focusing on education and research in career counseling and career development in Canada. We found projects that create new knowledge and develop innovative resources. We have three main programs: CanAccess, the Canada Career Development Conference, which happened in January of each year on a hybrid format; the CareerWise.ca website, which featured the top news and view in the field with a French version called Orientation.ca; and the Canadian Journal of Career Development, which is free to access. CEREC also delivered learning through our webinar and event initiative, so you can learn more about all of the CEREC work and resourcing by visiting our website at cerec.ca. Now, just a couple of housekeeping notes for today's webinar. So as mentioned in the intro, this series is delivered to you on a similar format with the presentation pre-recorded. So feel free to share your question and comment with our presenter at any point by using the chat. We will have a Q&A session toward the end of the webinar, during which our presenter will be live with us in the chat to address your question. Finally, please note that we will also share resources and a copy of the slide within the next 24 hours. Now, I would like to introduce you to our two presenters, Trevor Lehman and Brian Mallett. Trevor Lehman is president of the Climate Informed Counselor chapter of the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association, CCPA, and a career consultant with the University of Manitoba. Our second presenter is Brian Mallett. Brian is a certified human resources leader, and he is the Indigenous career consultant with Spencer College and a Designing Your Life certified coach. Brian shares a deep passion for empowering people to chase their dream. We are grateful to Trevor and Brian for sharing their perspective and suggesting action toward a more equitable world for our clients. So let's not wait any longer for officially starting this series with them.
Well, hello and welcome to our webinar on decent work on a changing planet. I'm Brian Malott, and I will be one of the co-facilitators, and I'll let Trevor introduce himself.
Hey everybody, glad to be here. So glad for you to all join us today for the CIRIC webinar. Big thanks to CIRIC for having us and letting us come and talk today to you, as this is part one of a two-part series that we're really excited to describe. I'll pass it back to Mike, or I'll give a brief introduction to myself, and then I'll let Brian talk a little bit about himself and his background, and then we'll kind of get into it. Broadly speaking, I'm a life transitions guy. I have a background in counseling, and I do a lot of career work in University of Manitoba, helping students kind of figure out what they want to do with their life. Outside of that, I also do a fair bit of grief counseling work on my side, and often helping people at the other end of life and sort of accept the changes and the choices that they've made. Beyond that, I'm the president of the Climate Informed Counselors of Canada, so our counselors chapter of CCPA of Canada. So I do a lot of work with therapists who are kind of helping clients with managing the distress of living on a changing world. I'll pass it back to Brian to do his introductions.
Yeah, I'm Brian Malott. I work as an Indigenous career consultant at a college in Ontario, and kind of been doing career development for probably about 12 plus years. Before that, I was a certified human resource professional and worked in HR functions for probably about 6, 7 years before that. And I think one of my side things I like to do is just kind of do some life design with people using like design thinking and kind of work through their business needs or their career kind of goals and stuff. And yeah, that's kind of some of the stuff I do on the side. Yeah, I'm looking forward to kind of having spend the next hour or so with you nice folks talking about kind of decent work on a changing planet, and just we're gonna give you some practical strategies and go from there.
Absolutely. So with that said, want to talk a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today, but also what we're not going to be talking about today. So today's going to be a lot more about talking about decent work, kind of the theoretical sort of framework behind that. We're going to be talking a bit about a just transition and how it relates to climate. And we're going to be talking a bit about consciousness raising within our clients and how we can kind of look at collective action in its many forms and how we can really impart that in our practice. Next session, we're going to be talking a lot about truth and reconciliation specifically, as well as career theories and kind of how they all tie together in the work that we do, though we will be talking a lot about Indigenous teachings as well in this session. But specifically, if you're here for the truth and reconciliation sort of framework, you're going to get a bit more of that in the second session, along with the career theories. Anything to add, Brian, before we get moving on?
Yeah, I think we're hoping to share a couple of insights and just give you some things that we're thinking about, and we'll engage in conversations both kind of during and after the presentations as well. So,
okay. So there's a bit of a background to this presentation. And in order to kind of grasp it, if you want to read further on this, there are 4 resources that we've highlighted. Depending on the nature of this webinar, we might have emailed them out ahead of time, but 2 of these were ones that I wrote, Closing the Climate Crisis Hope Gap, which talks a lot about how, as career professionals, we can help clients in terms of career management skills and one-on-one with clients. Today, we're going to be talking more about the group as a whole and more societal implications, but that article will cover that. And the thing we never talk about in career development talks a little bit about organized labor and kind of the background on that. Brian, did you want to talk a little bit about the other 2 articles?
Yeah, the other 2 articles, so both kind of articles from the CareerWise website, and one's kind of the talking about the resources, exploring Indigenous worldviews and career development, which is a good article that has a lot of good foundational knowledge there. And then the other one's the 16 resources to help settlers understand and advance Indigenous reconciliation. So another just reflective thing that gets you thinking about different ways to explore your practice and how to make them more reconcilable.
Absolutely. So again, we recommend reading those. They'll kind of go into a bit more depth than we have today, but it also kind of grounds some of the material that we don't have as much time to touch on today. So what we will be discussing we're going to talk a little bit about good work and career management skills, which is sort of an area that I think career professionals do a lot of work in that space. Then we're going to be talking about decent work and a just transition and how that relates to kind of the climate crisis, how we can promote decent work, and then we're going to kind of conclude for today. So a few years back, I'd written an article where I talked a little bit about kind of the hope gap, which is basically sort of the idea that a lot of people, if they're found that if they were concerned about climate change, but didn't know a clear pathway on how they could create change, they would become often cynical or disengaged. And after that, I wrote an open access guide. Goes from my website, which we'll link to both of our resources at the end, but called An Imperfect Guide to Climate and Career. I wrote a CareerWise article for it that also talked a lot about how we can help our clients find work that is meaningful to them in, on a changing world, and how they can kind of get that sense of empowerment. And it often falls back into what we kind of call good work, which I often draw on self-determination theory, which sort of looks at, if all things being equal, before we even start looking at interests and values in a person, if we want to think about what jobs often do people find a positive effect in or have a positive experience with, well, they want life and work that lets them feel like they're making their own choices, that they're autonomous, and that they're pursuing who they want, what they want to. We're looking at types of work that give a sense of mastery, a sense that people know what they're doing and they're getting better at it. And of course, a sense of connection with others, or relatedness. And I think career development professionals do that really, really well. I think that we often help our clients adapt to their work environments. We give them insight into their interests, their values, their personality, whether it's Civicus's life design or it's strong interest or MBTI. We do a lot to really help people explore themselves inwardly. And then we help them interact with their environment, job search, interview prep, and resume. What we're going to be talking a lot about today, though, is going beyond the individual and thinking, well, how can our clients interact with those around them in order to create larger change that would benefit not only their own lives, but the lives of society and the planet more broadly. And that's where the idea of a just transition comes in. So it's been around since the 80s, and basically it always has been kind of about the idea of making sure that as we make environmental policy changes, as we make these new things coming into effect, we make sure that we don't leave anyone behind, and we make sure that all people, including them and those that are traditionally oppressed, are not going to be left behind, that this must be a tide that rises all boats. So the International Labor Organization has a really great definition where they talk about greening the economy in a way that is as fair and as inclusive as possible to everyone concerned, and ensuring that we create not just jobs, because not all jobs are created equal, but that we create decent jobs. And that these jobs, so to ensure that everyone is going to have the best chance to enjoy their life as much as possible. So again, decent work, but is sort of the result of pursuing a just transition. And specifically as career development professionals, we feel that we are poised to help not only advocate for our clients, but empower our clients to create that decent work opportunities. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian to talk a little bit more.
And one of the things that we want to kind of talk about is that kind of coming from the kind of indigenous holistic kind of worldview, right? And looking at, I know myself coming from an indigenous background, that I look at kind of that heart, mind, body, spirit elements, right? And I think when we talk about decent work, what does that could look like, right? So when we're talking about heart, we're talking about the emotion and kind of feelings that are associated with work, which a lot of those might lay into kind of some of that personality stuff that we kind of talk about what your interests are and how that could kind of tie in with the emotion. When we're talking about mind, it's the kind of the ability to have creativity and thought in your work, as well as just the mindsets that you bring to the work environment. So what does that look like when we're exploring decent work? Kind of the body is kind of the physical aspects of work. So it's both the physical on your body, it's also the environment, the nature of it. So how does that kind of relate? And lastly, the spirit. So the spirit can be kind of the unseen world, the world that you're kind of connected to outside of yourself. There's also, I can see some of the correlations when you look at things like personalities and interests and values. Those kind of come to that intrinsic part of your being, who you are. And we talk about that in the career management structures, right? So how do we encourage that element into the workplace? So As we go, I'll kind of touch on some of these through our teaching, like our teachings and our material that we're sharing, but also just kind of get you to frame that as you're in there. And I'd encourage you to just, I know when I'm coming into webinars, you're bouncing from one to another and like Zooms all day. So just take a moment and just kind of ground yourself too, and to just kind of being the present as we're kind of talking about some of this.
Good. Absolutely. Thank you, Brian. And again, we'll if people need a moment to get comfortable with the space they're in, and when you're ready, we're gonna keep moving forward. So when we talk about decent work, there's a lot of that word can get thrown around a lot, but we ground it in a definition by the International Labor Organization, which talks about, among other things, really the opportunity for work that is productive and delivers a fair income. So again, a living wage, a wage that people not only can survive on, but can thrive on. We want security in the workplace and social protection for all, and this can be job security, again. This can be also physical security. I used to work in forestry, and whether it's forestry, security, restaurants, there's this public, this safety, both socially and individually, and from a physical standpoint. We want better prospects for personal development and social integration. So again, opportunities that work allows us to develop and continue to grow, but also to integrate and feel connectedness with others, which overlaps a little bit with self-determination theory we talked about earlier. And then also freedom for people to express their concerns and organize and participate in decisions that affect their lives, and equality of opportunity and treatment for all men, women, and all individual groups of all orientations. So again, that's a really critical piece, that people feel that they have the freedom to express themselves as they are, not only in their identity, but in their opinions and their ideas about this, and that they also have a say in how their work is organized and structured, because often people are experts on themselves and they have a good sense of maybe what their work environment could need in order for them to thrive and flourish. So when it comes to how we talk about this to clients, there's sort of a number of different resources we're going to draw on here, but four of them that kind of stand out. One is one of the best named journal articles I ever came across, The Call of the Wild, Zookeepers' Callings and the Double-Edged Sword of Deeply Meaningful Work. What they looked at was zookeepers and how they kind of perceived themselves. And one of the really interesting insights about it was that it looked at a lot of people who really saw their work as a calling, and how they may have derived a lot of satisfaction from their work. The kind of, I do it for free, and I can relate. I really love career development work, but that it also made them vulnerable to exploitation depending on their employment situation. So this was something that was really important, and it kind of looks at how people perceive their work as being contextual and kind of grounded in the type of workplace they're in. That while there can certainly be a benefit to having work that is meaningful and does align with our interests and values and all that, it's also important that the perspective they bring to it be reflective of their work environment, in order to ensure that people aren't exploited and don't fall out of decent work in the pursuit of good work. Ryan, did you want to talk about the next one?
Yeah, the next one's kind of a study I found from Statistics Canada, and it was talking about how Indigenous workers were impacted during the COVID-19 crisis, and also the kind of the payments through the CERB thing. And what was kind of interesting in that report is it showed that Indigenous workers employed in certain industries were impacted more than others, non-Indigenous individuals. So seeing the kind of the percentages and the breakdowns look like a lot of hard numbers, but really shows a lack of security in the workplace, and how when something as disruptive as the pandemic hit, it really did hit the Indigenous workers in those sectors in a hard way, right? So like hit them a little, just higher, bigger percentages of people having to access government funds and responses. So it's just an interesting article I found that talks about kind of that. And I talk about a little bit in the work I do too, just to explore how do we help kind of get those decent work opportunities.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And again, that it sounds like it's like that they're getting disproportionately kind of impacted there too. A couple other articles that kind of came up, speaking of kind of that Ryan's point about sort of the CERB and COVID. One was actually one put out by the Brookings Institute that talked a bit about how Amazon and Walmart, just how much money they kind of provided or made during the COVID pandemic. And one thing that I observed while I was, one of those ones that was very fortunate to be able to work remotely was, again, that rise of kind of hero pay and how they would call their workers heroes. But then there started to be research coming out showing that some of these large companies were making 3 times, or they could have paid their workers 3 times as much as they were making, or more, and that they didn't. They chose not to. And that some of these benefits that were provided during COVID were unfortunately quickly clawed back. So one thing that's really important to think about is that we saw some of these impact on how workers were treated during COVID. And with the climate crisis worsening, we're going to see this start impacting individuals here. And traditionally, again, in the global south, and some of the as well as in individuals that in society are traditionally oppressed, and those that the resources are least equitably distributed to are often going to be vulnerable to being hardest hit by organizational decisions. And we're seeing that even recently. I pulled an article from The Guardian talking about the governor of Texas made a decision to basically make it so that municipalities essentially couldn't instate local rules to ensure that workers had regular water breaks despite record heat waves. And again, just that there's this level of vulnerability that individuals are being exposed to, and that often these organizational decisions are kind of really directly against their interests, and that this can not only affect their benefits in CERB, their wages, but their physical health as well. I've suffered extreme heat exhaustion before. It is no joke. And I think it's really important that we keep in mind with our clients that we take kind of a big approach to how can we ensure that they stay safe, and that while the work lines up with their values and their interests, that we also ensure that they feel empowered to not be exploited or put at risk. Anything you wanted to add, Brian, before I move on?
I think just kind of all 4 articles touch on kind of that different perspectives and different things. And we're just kind of looking to encourage you to look at some articles again and get some more deeper understanding of how, I guess, the inequities look in the workplace. We kind of all know what it theoretically looks like, but just kind of reading some more stories and hearing a bit more about what that could look like.
Mm-hmm.
So in one of the, as we did some research for this, talking about decent work and pursuing dignity, we're not really saying anything new. Here's a kind of a quote from a book I was reading that was kind of from the 1930s, and it was going through the Depression as they're trying to get work going. And it kind of, one of the lines that stood out to me was that when we're just talking about how that the problem of finding necessary work and decent work has always been there, right? And how do we help and empower our clients to be able to find that kind of decent work within their context, and what does that mean? So just kind of highlighting that.
Absolutely. And if I can just add to that too, from a counseling perspective, the idea of sort of having that political consciousness goes back to at least, I think, to the 70s, when we had feminist therapy. We have the addition of multicultural theories of counseling. We have LGBT and inclusive counseling. That idea of consciousness raising and that kind of recognition that beyond making the individual figure out how to navigate their environment, it's also important that we empower and create change at the environmental level and the systemic level to benefit the individuals, and ensure that, again, no one's sort of left behind. And that's been going on for the last 50 years in these different areas of counseling theory. So again, what we're talking about today is not that we want to recognize that we certainly weren't the first people to say it. So when we come to how do we kind of look at raising consciousness, we're going to kind of go through some 5 different kind of areas that we can see here. And then next webinar, we're going to talk a lot about how the relation of, again, those integrating career theory and integrating truth and the truth and reconciliation concepts into it. But we wanted to make sure today that we also just sort of gave some ground up kind of strategies you can use with clients. So the first is obviously defining decent work. So of course we want to still do the career management. We want to talk about their skills, their interests, their dreams, but we also want to see what at a very fundamental level is essential in their workplace to do that. That we want to really look at, does the work deliver fair income? Does it offer security? Do they feel safe there? Does this provide better prospects for, the development and growth? And that while individuals can change jobs, we know that not all individuals have that is sometimes a luxury, or that they want to, and that we can also use this initial definition of decent work in addition to good work and the client's own traits to kind of really look at beginning to open the door around conversations around how you can potentially perceive decent work through collective action or getting together with your colleagues to try to create these spaces and these elements in your workplace if they aren't already there.
What I like about these kind of
sorry, too quick on the keyboard.
It's all good. What I was gonna say, what I like about those kind of 4 questions and that kind of shifting in mindset is, I think they're great conversations to have with your clients or people who are kind of looking at job transition, or just kind of even people just kind of looking at living their life, right? And talking about like what's fair income, but what kind of income you need to kind of have the life you're kind of looking to have, right? Or what does security look like for you in your kind of workplace, right? And so what are some things that you value? Talking about the better prospects for development and social integration. I think career development, we are always talking about how we kind of better and grow and develop our careers, right? And I think having those moments to talk to the people we're kind of fortunate enough to journey with, just help them kind of think about that, and talking about kind of their ability to kind of work with others to kind of collaboratively get the equality and the opportunities that they want, right? So I think these are great things to kind of ponder and question, like help people kind of reflect on as they're kind of going through that kind of stress and like thinking through how do we find decent work in this changing world, right? So I think it's things that probably people are intrinsically thinking about, but you often don't take the time to just pause and think about that.
For sure. And in that route, we also see sometimes, I do a lot of work with clients sometimes around boundary setting and interpersonal relationships. And one thing that we often talk about is sometimes, I'm a pretty agreeable person. I'm not usually too prone to conflict, but one thing that I was once sort of posed as a question that I thought was interesting was sort of the idea of, can you have conflict within a collaborative relationship? We've all had friendships and intimate relationships where, there might be conflict periodically, but that does not mean that it destroys the relationship. And likewise, in the workplace, there can be disagreements. Often organized labor gets kind of used as an equivalent to saying about very specific types of business unionism, but often organized labor and collective action movements of all sorts sometimes do highlight the inequities and the inequalities and sometimes challenge larger power structures, but that they do so without necessarily shattering the structures, but really sometimes some equalizing them, right? Redistributing. So we see this in the environmental movement a lot, that a lot of times there's a really excellent book called Future on Fire, written by a professor at the U of M, David Camfield, who talks a lot about, again, organized labor having work within the environmental sector. And that sometimes that does put them at conflict with the organizations, their employers, but that out of this comes a more equitable outcomes. That, again, conflict doesn't necessarily need to lead to destruction, but that it can actually have results that end up being much more positive, especially for those that are most most oppressed and most likely to lose the most. Brian, I'll toss it over to you.
Here we're kind of looking at the when we're talking about decent work. I think Indigenous people's access to decent work and that social protection that comes from it, I think, is something that we sometimes overlook. I know as Trevor and I were kind of building the presentation, it took us a bit to find some good resources on some of this. And I think one of the things I kind of see in the work I do all the time is just that having access to the mechanisms that get you to your first jobs and stuff, like, so having opportunities to have those first summer jobs, have those other things, those kind of build up to the decent work. And I think it's important as we explore that, how to kind of address also some of the inequities of the kind of employment rates between the Indigenous people of Canada and the non-Indigenous people of Canada. How do we close those gaps? So that's one of the things that we'll kind of talk on as well. But just kind of something we were thinking about too.
Absolutely. And again, sort of the thinking in a lot of our research has always been kind of, on one hand, there's a lot of talk about how we make the individual better adapted to their environment, but then the idea that some of these big problems really require a bunch of people getting together and really focusing their efforts to creating that change within their organization, within society more broadly.
And one of the things that we kind of talked about was the privilege of our knowledge. Trevor and I, as we've been talking and we're kind of planning for this for a couple of months and stuff, really focused on we've had a lot of positionality training and stuff, fortunate through our careers and our roles, right, that talk about race and gender and health and workers' compensation and safe working. But how do we bridge those into our clients and our training opportunities that could be there? So we were thinking about different clientele that might not get those training opportunities to have kind of talking about kind of positionality or EDI within their workplace. So how do we, as career developers, kind of share that knowledge and be able to impart that wisdom to our clients?
Absolutely. And I think that when we were kind of coming at it, we really had sort of an intersectional lens. So again, seeing this as our race, the gender orientations and identities, and then health being a huge one. We've also seen clients who've, certainly had acute injuries that really created a change in career, but we've also seen chronic illnesses, which is something that's pretty close to my heart. I don't wear these glasses just to look cool, and kind of looking at how recognizing that sometimes we have to meet clients where they're at, and that some of these identities may or may not be as aware, and sometimes bringing them up can be really helpful. Sometimes when I'm working with clients, often health will be a thing that I really reiterate. Again, worked in forestry, can appreciate that some jobs will take a toll on the body, and that while there's immediate injuries, and we all think about like a tree branch falling on you, we don't always think about what's the effect on the body of climbing trees every day. And also that can look at from helping clients with the workers' compensation and safe work, and really ensuring that even if they are really loving their job and they're, again, that going back to that Call the Wild article, again, they find it deeply meaningful and engaging, that they don't risk their own safety, they don't risk, and that we really sometimes bring these up preemptively to ensure that when clients are in unsafe work environments or in environments that might violate their labor rights, that they're aware of the resources, which we're going to share shortly. All right, Brian.
And I think throughout this, we've been kind of talking about kind of decent work and kind of different things that kind of fall into it. And I think kind of coming back into that kind of holistic approach of looking at the workers that are looking for decent work. How does the work kind of connect to their heart, mind, body, spirit? How is it connecting to your emotions, kind of connecting to kind of what you intrinsically value and is important to you, your family and your community relations, and all those things kind of play into that decent work. And I think as we talked about kind of different work settings and where decent work usually doesn't come with the compensation necessarily. Said that wrong. we find that finding decent work is kind of takes into account all four of those areas, right? And how does it value the individual as a whole, and not just as a cog at the machine? Any insights to add into that, Trevor?
I think that's a really good overview. And again, kind of taking that holistic view, that it's not just about, a job, but that it's also about, there's sort of these group aspects that are kind of playing in there as well. There's a really beautiful quote that I always thought about that kind of brings this together, which is Lilla Watson, who's an Indigenous advocate from Australia, who talks a little bit about, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I think this also ties back to the climate particularly, because we are in many ways all in this together. And this isn't about what got us into this mess in a lot of ways is some groups getting more benefits or some people thinking they're better than others, and really taking kind of a humble approach that looks at how can we work together to create better work environments, better living environments, and a better world for all of us. One article that I really love from CareerWise that I'll highlight is websites to help you and your clients know your labor rights. Again, people don't need to be experts on labor law, but I think as career professionals, it's really, really important that clients have a good sense of what their safety rules are, what their employment rules are, and that clients need to be able to reference this, not every day, hopefully, but that when they need to, and that they need to be powerful advocates for themselves as well as their fellow workers, to know and support each other in ensuring that the protections that are in place are used. Just because right now we are seeing things like where the protections are being taken away, like again that Texas governor with the heat bill, or removing water breaks, and there might be some collective action that has to happen in order to get protections put in place. The other half of it, though, is that when the protections are in place, making sure that you know that they exist and can utilize them effectively in a way that can ensure, again, that maintenance of decent work once it's been achieved.
I think this is a great tool just to put away in your toolbox. Like, I know we say that all the time in career development, but I think it's having it available to you when you want to kind of talk about labor rights with your clients and how to help them understand what it is. And they may be even kind of new to the world of work or new to Canada and may not be well aware of the rights that they have available to them, right? So just encourage you to look at that and all the other resources that CareerWise puts out too. There's a lot of good tools there.
Absolutely. So when it comes to helping clients find their power, again, no two situations are alike. We really don't advocate a one-size-fits-all approach, as Brian sort of highlighted many times with the wheel. But it is important that clients sort of recognize their inherent value, as well as sometimes the social pressures that sometimes challenge that or challenge that status. There's a really good sort of thought experiment put out by I think my friend Brian Hutchinson, when he talked about this example of imagining you're the mayor of a small town and you have enough funding, or you have a funding issue and you have to cut one of two different positions. You either have to cut the local doctor or doctors, or you have to remove the funding for waste disposal workers. And kind of what would be more important? And of course, there's no easy answer, right answer for that. Obviously, when you need a doctor, you need a doctor. But also decide that if you don't have regular waste disposal, you're going to have a cholera outbreak in 2 or 3 weeks. But if you tell people, I'm going to go work as a waste management worker, or I am a waste management worker versus I'm a doctor, you'll see very quickly in society how status is assigned higher to some than others. Again, even if you're saying even though this is essential to the functioning of society, we need, and we're going to explore this a lot more in the second session, but we're really going to talk, we often ask the one quite easy way we kind of can provoke this conversation in our conversations with clients is sometimes asking, like, why the ladder? Clients often feel they have to take promotions and move up these positions to manage others or to have these sort of higher status ones, but that even if the initial job they were doing was essential. We also know that we reward some of the jobs more than others, and that this isn't always necessarily commensurate with how essential it is to society. And this is really important for our work because we really want to make sure that people don't feel devalued as human beings based on the work they do, and that we also don't recognize that financial compensation is necessarily connected or correlated with the value to society of what the person is doing or the value as the person. I want to talk a little bit about further readings, but I wanted to bounce over to Brian. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, and I think what you were saying about the compensation and the societal for kind of glam that goes with a job, I guess, right? And I think it goes back to kind of looking at how's it connected with the client or the individual you are kind of supporting on their journey, right? What are kind of their intrinsic, what are their values, what is important to them, and how do you help them reframe the maybe some of the mindsets that they have around some of that pressure to always kind of keep climbing that ladder, right? Being where you are and being kind of happy, but also being able to feel like you are in a spot where decent work is, I think is a valued thing that we should share and encourage to our clients and our people we support. And yeah, so just kind of thinking about how to help clients feel more that they have power in those things, right? That they may even already be in decent work. They just might have to reframe it a bit so they understand where they're at.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think also for some of them that are maybe not being paid a living wage, ensuring that, if there isn't a minimum wage that's meeting their needs, that, they feel empowered to take action, either politically or within their own workspace, to, request or desire and put forward sort of requests for what they as a group and as a collective, because again, a lot of times sometimes the problem facing one individual might be shared by their coworkers, and that creates again a greater amount of relatedness, greater amount of connection, but also a greater amount of their own power, that if people do work together, they can see their wages increase, their work, but not just wages, because I think sometimes collective action and organized labor gets really focused on that, but that this is things that also brought us a lot of the workplace health and safety, regular working hours, maternity, paternity leaves were often historically connected to the work of collective action. And I think it's important that clients know that, and again, it's not in every situation, that's not what we're saying, but we are saying that that can be an option, particularly when we find people are finding themselves devalued and being pushed out of that decent work. How they do that, there's a whole slew of readings that we could probably talk about, but for in terms of some open access resources, Activist Handbook really does a good job of talking about kind of more of is a good introduction to kind of systemic or systems level thinking, and also very geographically localized. So it kind of recognizes that what works, in Manitoba might not work in Ontario, might not work in New York, different areas everywhere. As we know that careers and the job market are different, we also know that individuals' concerns and their ways of dealing with them can be different. Labor Notes provides a good range of just templates and resources for sort of structures for whether it's negotiation and bargaining or organizing. Center for Future Work, which is out of Canada and Australia, has a really good range of articles and economics on, again, the need for decent work, the need for, and sometimes the situations where collective action is required to get it. And Jane McKelvey, who's sort of a famous organizer, did a lot of work with nurses unions in the States. She wrote a really good book called No Shortcuts, Organizing for Power in the New Gilded Age. And her work is really helpful in that it frames collective action as a way of obtaining or maintaining dignity, and that this isn't always around wages or work, but that this is more also about working conditions and ultimately respect, and not feeling disempowered and not feeling oppressed by others and not feeling discriminated against. So excellent book. I believe the first chapter is free online if you just Google it. But those are some that we often see as really fundamental if you're looking to kind of get kind of our mind around some of these bigger questions. Great. So anything else you wanted to add, Brian, before we move to conclusion?
I think I would just kind of encourage, check out some of those further readings. And there's a lot of great information in there. And I know we had kind of, we really wrestled on how to get the presentation down to kind of the time allotted for us today. So really want to kind of suggest some of the readings that were there because we felt they were useful. And I know Trevor and I both use them on kind of our work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we're going to leave some time for Q&A. We've included our emails here, our websites, and our LinkedIn. We're available on all three. For myself, I have a lot of open access resources on my website that I post, with around more of the individual career management skills. But again, this workshop was much more around how do we help clients with both from a consciousness raising, recognizing the need for decent work, and then recognizing that it's not always all up to them and that they can sometimes work together with others to help create the world they want to live in, and that group problems sometimes deserve group solutions.
Yeah, I would encourage you to kind of reach out to me and Trevor. We love questions. We love kind of trying to help with that. I know we're going to have some Q&A time now after the recording. And we were just going to say, if there's some questions that you might not want to ask during a recording or live, just feel free to email it to us and we can kind of talk about some of that on there as well as need be.
Absolutely. We want to be as inclusive as possible. So again, if people don't have a question they want to maybe put here, you can also email it to us. We're happy to talk through that. Again, thanks everyone for your time. We hope this has been useful to you. We do hope that you come back for part 2, where we're going to be talking again further about this and its relation to career theory and truth and reconciliation. We hope this has given a good foundation. Again, we know people of different kind of knowledge levels. We're here about decent work and organized or decent work in collective action, but we're hoping that this has given a good primer to it, as well as seeing the connection to the climate crisis. Because again, there's a lot of focus on the climate crisis as what can I do as an individual, and this presentation really looks at what can we do collectively, or how can we get others on board with doing this. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.